Hi all, let's have a look at another very interesting game from the Norway tournament. So Altibox Norway, this was in the fourth round, Hikaru Nakamura against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So two very exciting players. We see e4 from Nakamura, a Sicilian defense, and we go into the Najdorf variation. And the most popular moves include moving the bishop here or here, or moving this bishop here or here, f2, f3, h3, a4. Those are all very popular. And after that comes this move in popularity, according to ChessBase live book, bishop d3. So a little bit of a a novelty move. It has been played before, over 200 times, but it's quite rare to do this. And usually players with black react with e6. So for example, f4, queen c7. This kind of example game sequence has been seen before against this bishop d3, and it looks as though, you know, sometimes the bishop's taken, but that might give the c file, for example, if it is taken. So anyway, e5 locks in that bishop, but it does have a concession for these two squares, of course, fixed structure. Now the knight going here is actually quite interesting. Sometimes the knight goes here, but only rarely. So the knight going here is the more common, because it does have a route for knight g3 to eye this square. We have bishop e7, both sides castling. Now knight g3. So it seems quite an interesting position for white, looking at that f5 square at the moment. Bishop e6, and now knight d5, very interesting move, which actually emphasizes the bishop. If this is taken, which it is, then the bishop is improved. If it's not taken, I believe white's going to just get a bind on the position. If that knight is left there, maybe white doesn't even have to play a move like c4, but c4 is interesting with a bind. It looks like a fairly pleasant sort of position. So anyway, it's actually taken. Bishop takes d5 with the bishop. Maybe it's worth considering this way, but not taking here, of course, because the bishop takes h7, where white's slightly better there. But this position with bishop c8 might actually be playable. So anyway, it was actually taken with the bishop though, so e takes. So again, if knight takes, then there's bishop takes h7 check. We have g6, c4, and actually with the knight here, it looks as though even h4, h5 might be playable. Black can react with h5. It's not like a killer threat idea, but black could just play knight bd7 and react with h5. That should be okay, but it's something to bear in mind here. We see knight e8, which stops h4 anyway, and also prepares to kind of fianchetto the knight here after bishop h6, knight g7. Now Nakamura plays on the queen side with b4. So this is interesting. The idea of c5 sometimes creates a dangerous pawn. Knight d7, but it has to be carefully prepared. Rook c1, and black tries to kind of undermine white a bit here, trying to activate the rook. a3, a takes, and the rook actually enters rook a3. Adventurous rook here. Knight e4 is played, and the threat now is actually c5 in this position. This is actually really dangerous, liberating white's pawns, and the reactive f5 was played. If it's not, I'll give you an example. Say rook a8, c5 takes d6, this position, bishop b5, threatening bishop takes, and knight f6. White eventually gets to play b takes c5 then, and has a massive position. That's an example disaster scenario. So c5 does seem to be the positional threat. You might think, well, hold on, can't black do something like b6 here? Let's have a quick look. b6. I think it's just pleasant for white still anyway. And maybe there's a possibility of this kind of thing. Yeah, I think if f5 we can go here and, you know, with knight b5 with tempo, say the rook voluntarily goes back, this position looks pleasant enough anyway for white, an advantage for white. Okay, it's kicked anyway. We still have knight c3 with ideas like this with tempo. You might think, well, was that a bit of a wasted move having the rook there? e4, bishop e2, and now the threat really is knight b5 is looking annoying in some lines here, especially if in conjunction with knight d4 and bishop g7 and knight e6. So actually this bishop as part of that is challenged immediately. We have bishop takes g5, queen takes, and now actually white pushes through immediately here with c5. So what is going on here? c5 here. You might think, well, black actually played knight e5. If he does play to take this pawn like this, then we do see knight b5 with tempo and on the rook, and that's pretty desperate for black. Black has the desperate rook d3, but it's insufficient compensation here. And you might think, hold on, let's follow this through, because isn't this really scary looking? White can actually expose the black king more than the white king gets exposed. So with that exchange sack as an example, and white's just better. So okay, we have actually knight e5, and still there seems to be a storm brewing here with these pieces, you know, things like this. There seems to be a big storm brewing here, but white pushes with c6, and this knight tries to enter the attack now with knight f4, knife f4, as Ben Feingold says. If taking here, trying to eliminate this, there's this diagonal of death, queen d5 picking up the knight, so that's not really possible. So knight h5, that's eliminated before it ever reaches f4, and now a calm move, king h1. The crazy thing about this position, you'd have to be a computer to know this, the follow-ups, otherwise there's no point in knowing the move here. It does seem technically, just for those interested, that c takes b7 is better for white. You might think, isn't that pawn kind of vulnerable, potentially, like just being picked off with rook a7? I'll just show you this example. There's crazy stuff here. Taking on e4, rook c7 with the idea of b8. So winning an exchange there. Say black gets out of the way. This position. So I know it's a full knight down, but white threatens f4 here. And this position with the pawn on b7, even though white's a knight down, is apparently winning for those technically interested. But I don't think any human would ever see this follow-up. This is just a fictional sci-fi follow-up where white actually has to carefully prepare this as a threat by first making sure he's not getting back row mated, then pinning the queen, and then this becomes a threat, so that moves, and then finally white can kind of actually get the material investment back. But that's pretty deep stuff from c takes b7. From a human perspective, it's much more sensible just to play what Nakamura played, which was king h1. There's also, you would have to factor in the check here, but this is harmless. We can just take here. This is much easier to see that we can eliminate that stuff. But yeah, it's a fantasy variation there, but it does see c takes b7. Yeah, is a bit crazy. We have king h1, much more sensible. So just unpinning there. Queen h4, so still some storm brewing here. Knight g4 to threaten mate. But now, in fact, let's have a look at an alternative here before we go into the queen h4, in the form of knight d3, because it does actually hit the rook and puts pressure on f2. White can actually react with, probably best is knight b5. So say taking, and now taking on b7. This position would be about equal. So actually, you know, we need, it's interesting. So knight d3, white has to actually, let's just check this sequence again. So yeah, c takes b7 would be a mistake here if we had this forcing line. In fact, it seems white does better. There's other stuff for white to do a little bit better here rather than committing to c takes b7, because that pawn, yeah, can easily be eliminated in that context. Queen c2, for example, this might be more dangerous. So queen c4. This kind of queenside pressure might be more dangerous. So it's interesting anyway that knight d3 as an alternative, it seems a very good try here. If rook c2, just knight takes b4, and this is actually quite annoying. Yeah, you know, this kind of position can easily lead to equality. Technically, because actually this pawn like can easily be rounded up, I think, with rook b8 coming. So yeah, it seems this is interesting. It's got a very specific idea, but there's actually a way. Well, let's see. There's a brilliant move here played from a defensive point of view in this position, which is really kind of a little bit defensive magic, actually. I wonder if you can guess it in advance of a lot of the key threats. What does white play here, which is a kind of defensive but looks positional as well? If I give you 5 seconds, what would you play with white? Okay, the top goal scorer in my view is the queen, but it's actually also the best defender sometimes. Queen d4. It looks in all directions, but the key one for defense is this diagonal. So watch out for this diagonal. We have knight g4, threatening mate. So that's parried. Now we have f4, and it looks as though everything's conspiring quite well against the white king, yeah, because like f3 is threatened. Now the unpinning move is played, which threatens hg, and it's starting to get really scary, right? Because there's pressure on this side of the board as well. Let's have a look here. If black actually played e3, if he plays f3, we might be able to safely take here on e4 actually, and if taking here, keeping a pin there, and if here, we can actually probably take this and consolidate and actually lock down the files. Maybe just even play f4 there. So f3 doesn't seem to have much oomph to it because of queen takes e4. I think we can agree. So this e3 is very interesting. Now white has to tread very carefully, clearly. He played actually to take the knight. If, say he took care, queen g3, I think we snap off the knight. And it doesn't matter about f3, we could just take here and then knight e4, and that's kind of the end of black there. So yeah, black has to be tricky how he's managing his attack here. So let's go back. So e3, Nakamura took on g4, which is, I think, the best move. Yeah, anything else like this, there's f3. That's the thing, and this is really getting scary because there's potentially f2 and queen well, let's have a look. There's potentially queen g3 actually threatening mate here and here. So I'll give you an example disaster scenario. f2 check, queen g3. Might have to give up the queen, because if taking, then it's mate. So that's the kind of thing which means actually after this e3 it's best to take this knight. It's best now to take this knight, because f takes, the strongest is f3, and it's getting scary. Yeah, and if rook takes f3, just taking here, and if takes here, then white gets mated. And if you might think, well, what about the pawn over here? Again, check, and it's too scary. Check is mating. So Nakamura did exactly the right thing, basically. Here, after e3, he snapped off the knight. H takes g4, but now there seems to be a really scary idea of g3. A really calm move, c takes b7, installing a really dangerous pawn though. You might think, well, isn't this the end of white after e takes with tempo? Not too many options. Now if queen takes f2, g3 with tempo threatens mate, then white would have to give up the queen. But the point here is soon to be revealed. Rook takes f2, g3. You might think, well, isn't that the same sort of disaster scenario? White to play here. If I give you 5 seconds. It's a bit of a crushing move now, actually, for black. To crush black. Okay. Rook takes f4, just to come. Rook takes f4. We have check, king f1. Now sometimes this is a handy resource, but actually that's not the point even here. The point is actually it's holding here, but sometimes this can be a fantastic defensive idea, queen g1, not here, after check, because the rook would be hanging. You know, if queen g1 we need to take the rook. Yeah, so no, the game ended here after king f1 though. Black didn't even play on. If he plays check, just king e2, and the queen is hit. And now say queen takes c1, then we can, with tempo, take here, and actually force a mate here by force because of that pawn queening. The other option here is taking on g2. But that's pretty harmless as well. If black takes on g2, king d3, and there's nothing really that black's able to do here. If he takes here, we can queen with check, probably best. And if here, queen g4 check is going to be mating. It's all with tempo, of course, for example. So yeah, there's nothing really to do after king d3 or even king d1. Yeah, all the checks have run out. Okay, so I'll go back to the game ending position, king f1. Yeah, sometimes that's useful, but it seems a very interesting game where almost a little bit like a story we had previously on the channel in this tournament where Nakamura was black against Magnus Carlsen, but he secured with black a perpetual check, if you remember. Here the king's kind of escaped actually. There's no perpetual check, the king's kind of escaped, and white's got a winning advantage in the form of that pawn over the queen side. So chess is such a vastly complex game. It's a story which ends favourably for white on this occasion, basically. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that one. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.